So for all that are on this call, I'm helping Bob by hosting this meeting, and I want to introduce our speaker, Aaron White, who lives up in Vancouver and is on the front lines of ministering to people on the margins up there. And he's a friend of People's Seminary, a friend of Tierra Nueva, and he's heavily involved in the 24-hour prayer rooms, right? Up there in Vancouver in the neighborhood he lives in. So we're really blessed to be able to have him sharing today.
It's fun to be able to share with you. This will be relatively informal, I think, and I expect probably a lot of your classes have been, just knowing Bob a little bit. And he sent me some of the material that he's been working on, so I'm going to run through that, and then I will intersperse with my own thoughts. And I'm not, I have no agenda to have to get through all of this stuff. I think you will have all the notes, so you can go through that as well. I'm very, very open to conversation and questions, and seeing where we get to together. And I suppose there may be some other people who come as well. I will share my screen in a second, because there is some things to look at. And what we'll do is we'll have a little conversation to begin with, and then we're going to talk about, we'll show some pictures and talk about the biblical warrant for advocacy, this word advocacy, which is in some ways something of it's not a word that's used quite so much anymore. It used to be used a lot in the Christian church, not so much anymore. It's been replaced by a few other words. So just wondering what, as we begin, today the topic is the place of advocacy, justice, and peacemaking in mission. And I'm curious as to what your understanding or your reaction to that word advocacy is. What do you see it as? And this is open to anybody to answer.
A voice on behalf of others.
Voice on behalf of others, yeah. Anything else?
That's kind of what I think of as well, is like speaking up for others who maybe can't find their voice, or walking alongside people who aren't feeling strong enough to do it by themselves.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
In particular, I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
For me, it's perhaps something in a court, in a tribunal, perhaps that people do to defend another, or to, yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the legal definition of advocacy, is to have an advocate, someone who is your attorney, who speaks on your behalf. And so we understand it in that light. You were going to say something else there, Jim?
Well, the legal, but also the political dimension. I mean, we're in the state of Georgia is set to execute a person tonight or later today. So it's that contacting representatives and, that kind of work on behalf, as advocates in certain situations like that.
Yeah. I'm so sorry to hear that. I mean, yeah. That really, it wrenches my heart every single time I hear that's going on. Yeah, and that's a very, very specific scenario where advocacy is clearly understood. The word advocacy in some ways has fallen out of favor, in part because people used to say things like, and still do in lots of cases, they say things like speaking for those who have no voice. And nobody used those words exactly here. But sort of the pushback to that is, well, everybody has a voice. And so to speak on behalf of those who we presume have no voice really can sometimes do the work of erasing their voice. But there are scenarios where we can understand what is meant by that. It's actually a biblical phrase, to speak for those who have no voice. And so in the scenario that you were mentioning, Jim, like it's not that the person who's on death row there has no voice. It's just that that voice sure needs to be amplified by all kinds of other people saying the same things. And so now people talk more about the amplification of a voice. But like in a court of law, I've spent lots of times in various courts of law, and you know, a good defense attorney typically says to their client, don't talk. You know, it's not that you don't have a voice, it's that, you know, the way that you are going to speak to the judge or others is probably not going to be the most helpful thing. And there's a certain skill and an ability that the defense attorney has in order to speak on behalf of their client. So these are some of the senses of this word advocacy. I think in some ways this word has been replaced by the word ally. I don't know if people are familiar with that term, if that's current where you are, the term ally. But I feel like that means something maybe a little bit different, ally and advocate. And so I want to talk more about this advocacy notion as we go along. So just a quick other question. Why do you think, or do you think that we should be doing this as followers of Jesus? Like, what are your thoughts on why should we advocate? Why, and to go maybe even more specific, why should we actually advocate for the poor, the orphan, the widow, the stranger, the slave?
Well, one reason could be that that's the example we saw Jesus doing. I feel like he advocated, or he was an ally to those who, you know, those who you mentioned.
Yeah. It's a model that Jesus does, and so we should follow footsteps of our Lord and Savior. Sure. Yeah, that would be one good reason. Any other good reasons?
Well, the prophetic dimension of our faith and of the scriptures, of being speaking to those in power or from the edges, and saying, here's what's really happening, that amplification of voices. I think I like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's certainly the pre-exilic prophets, for sure. They kind of had, one primary message, which was to return to the covenant. But when in the context of that return to the covenant, there was definitely a sense of a couple of problems that were keeping people from the covenant, a couple of very obvious ways they were not keeping the covenant. One would be the worship of idols, and the other would be the abuse of the poor. And these two things tended to go hand in hand because both tended to be about power. And so certainly, especially the pre-exilic prophets were constantly hammering on is stop worshiping idols, worship the Lord only, and care for the poor. In fact, I'll read out this quote. I don't have it on the PDF file, but this is by Jacques Ellul. I don't know if people have come across Jacques Ellul before. Very incredible writer, always convicts me deeply and worries me in his writing. He wrote a book called On Being Rich and Poor, and he's writing about the prophet Amos and his condemnation of the rich. And he writes, the prophetic condemnation of the rich in favor of the poor is not necessarily all about social justice. And I'll just stop there for a second and say, I think that that's sort of where we maybe, where that word advocacy and allyship, where now it's pretty much almost exclusively in the realm of social justice that we think of that. But Ellul says it's not necessarily all about social justice. Those are our ideas. In Amos, it is a question of the harm done to the poor being a harm done to God's people. What counts is not that the people are poor, but that they belong to the people of God. When the poor are persecuted, God himself is attacked. The evil is not so much a question of poverty, wealth, and injustice, but a lack of faith in God, a lack of obedience in observing the covenant, and a lack of love for one's neighbors. Otherwise, there would be no poor. It is these things that are at the very heart of the problem, rather than only social justice. The very existence of the poor is a revelation of a deeper evil. It reveals a lack of faith, obedience, and love. And it calls for a reorientation of society in general and a decision not to permit money to dominate it in particular. I think that is quite a powerful notion that Ilula is bringing forward. And even as I read it, I recognize it's somewhat fraught with tension, because we want we want to be saying we are advocating on behalf of the poor, we're allies of those who are poor. And Jacques Ellul is not saying that we shouldn't. He's saying that it's not just a matter of wealth and poverty. It goes actually deeper than that. Much deeper than that, into identification with God's people and a fulfilling of the covenant. So this is what the prophets were doing, was calling people back to the covenant, which had deep within its very heart a radical care for the poor in your midst, to the point where there actually was not supposed to be poor in your midst. So those are two good reasons that we follow Jesus, and it's part of our prophetic heritage that we do so. Are there any other good reasons why we should advocate, do you think, for those categories of people which show up again and again and again in Scripture: the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger?
Yes.
Can you maybe think go ahead, Jean-Pascal. Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Perhaps for me, we are all like foreigners, or we are poor in front of God, so we know what this means. We should know, or
yeah.
And then perhaps we have experienced something of this as a child of God, and then we can perhaps speak also to others, and just to take them with us in this way to meet Jesus.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's clear, but
no, it is, and I think it's incredibly important. I think that is an incredibly important reason that sometimes in our desire to do good, because we should do good and follow Jesus and so on, we sort of forget this. But if you're looking at the law and why Israel is commanded to care for the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the slave, why are they supposed to do that? Always. Yahweh says to them, because you were widows, orphans, foreigners, slaves in Egypt. You know what this is. I rescued you out of this. Understand that's who you were. Understand that you were in this place of deep need, and I heard your cry. So therefore, hear the cry of those in your midst. And when they don't hear the cry of the foreigner, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the poor in their midst, they actually, throughout the course of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, they actually start to take the place of Egypt. That God is attentive to the cry of the poor in their midst, in the exact same way that God was attentive to the cry of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. And that's not a good place to be in, is thinking that somehow you're above that, you're separate from that. So the way that I talk about it is, why should we care for the poor? Is because they're kin, they're our family, and we are not separate from, we are not different than. We are all in that place, if we're honest, and have all, in various ways, if we've received rescue from that place. And And so, I mean, power dynamics take you to a place where sometimes you just sort of forget that. So we have quite a few mission teams that come to my neighborhood in the downtown east side, and they want to come and bring Jesus to the poor. And so we have to disabuse them of that notion pretty quickly to say, actually, Jesus is already here. And really, the best way for you to engage this next week or whatever while you're here is to try and find Jesus and love Jesus, as opposed to trying to hand out Jesus, because that implies a certain kind of power dynamic. And usually, I know one of the very first moments when I moved here and I saw a lady down in the alley who was on some bad drugs and she just couldn't control her body. And I had this conversion moment where I really felt strongly, if the gospel can mean nothing to her, then it does mean nothing to me. Because if I somehow put myself in a place where I need it less than her, then I have trusted my background or my whatever it is, my sobriety or whatever it is, to have got me at least half the way towards salvation. You know, where Jesus is constantly actually pointing people towards that deeper level of humility and desperation. Like, you're sick, you're in need of a doctor. So the reason to advocate, in part, is this is our family. We're not other than. And so why wouldn't we do that? And that is the message that's given, particularly in the covenant, the law and the covenant, over and over and over again. Care for these people because you were and are these people. So don't forget that. I'll give you a little bit of my experience doing some of this stuff, and it's not, there's many with much more experience than me in terms of advocacy, but as I was even thinking through this last night, I thought there are varying levels of advocacy, and we're all engaged. We all can be engaged with this at all times, because sometimes there's some people who are skilled in defending somebody in court. There's some people, as Jim said, there's some people who would be part of movements that would be petitioning governors for the lives of people on death row. So those are certain levels of advocacy. There's advocacy that would be like a political advocacy of wanting certain bills passed, certain people's protected. I've been involved in advocacy with what would be called here in Canada, the Children's Aid Society. I don't know what the equivalent would be in the United States, but it's like child protection services. Yeah. So there's this child protection services in some ways would say they're advocating for the safety of children, and in many ways that's absolutely true. But we found that there was a need for parents to also have, and families to have, people who were willing to go with them to meetings with child protection services, because the power that particular government agency has is profound and terrifying. The ability to walk into your house and look around and say, well, it's a little bit dirty here, I'm going to take your children. I've literally watched that happen. And just the terror in people, and not knowing what they could possibly do. And so literally just having somebody else who was there in some kind of professional capacity to say, I also see what you're seeing, and I'll take pictures and I can give my side of the story, is an act of advocacy. And saying, I will join you in order to, when you have your visits with your children, and see how you interact, and I can give my side of the story here as well. That's a level of advocacy that we found is really necessary for people in terrible need and fear about what's happening with their children. And I imagine wherever you are, I imagine that's all, I expect that's a reality as well. And you'll probably be aware that is far more of a reality in communities that are poor, in communities of color, in communities where they're on any kind of edge of that socioeconomic scale, where there just feels like it's more vulnerable. People are more feel like they have less agency, less capacity to fight this system and this structure. So that'd be a level of advocacy that I've certainly been involved with. Also with parole officers, maybe some people have been involved in that as well, where again, parole officers feel like sometimes they have just the power of God over their charges, you know, and if somebody just, I've known people who've gone back to jail for years because they didn't completely stop at a stoplight. You know, they made a right-hand turn and there was a police officer following them and they just wanted to put them back in jail. So, you know, levels of advocacy there on that very grounded, just talking to someone talking to the parole officer as a human about another human. But I remember being in a meeting once with a parole officer and their client and a friend of mine, and this person just said, you know, do you think this person's really worth it? Like, and they were sitting in the room. They said, do you think they're actually worth your time? And I said, yeah, I do. Yeah, I really, really do. But just to be able to say that is a level of advocacy, like just to humanize somebody in the presence of somebody else who, for whatever reason, their heart's gone really hard. That is a level of advocacy for sure. Can be with pimps and dealers. You know, if there's people who owe money to a pimp or a dealer, that can be a real big issue. And so sometimes you have to be an advocate there. And my children have had to be advocates sometimes where they've had to go, don't, you know, we're on the street and someone's about to beat somebody down. And we just say, don't do that, please. You know, we're here. We care about this person. So that's a level of advocacy as well. The medical system. Has anyone ever had any difficult issues with the medical system? You know, I like my dad, he's very immuno compromised and was one of the local hospitals is just terrible and does not treat people well. And he and my mom feel really powerless in that scenario. You know, what are we going to do? How do we, and it just feels like there's nobody that you can talk to. And sometimes we need advocates who can kind of say, no, like, this is the kind of thing that you can do. And this is the person that you can talk to. And here's how to make this complaint. So these are very on the ground levels of advocacy. And I think sometimes when we think advocacy, we do think those big moments, you know, like the big campaigns, the stopping war and stuff like that. And that's part of it too. But I would suggest that if we're not practiced in the day-to-day levels, then probably we're not going to be ready for the big pieces. Because there are sometimes some big pieces, and I've been involved in some of those as well. And I recall there was a law in Vancouver that you couldn't have a tent up anywhere in the city overnight. That was a bylaw. It was illegal to do that. They were trying to stop tent cities, and I understand the problems with those. But we just thought this is a bit of a, you know, rather than just outlawing tents, what if you outlawed, you know, structures that caused homelessness? You know, what if you tried to find some kind of a better solution for that? So we spent a week with a number of our friends who were homeless, sleeping outside City Hall on the front lawn. And it couldn't have rained harder. I mean, it was a miserable week. It was just awful. But we slept there every night. And then every day as the city councilors came into the office, we would just kind of present what we thought was important to them. And just said, like, we're obeying. We didn't have tents. We just said, we'll obey the bylaw, but we'll obey it in your face. So you see what this looks like. That this is what a lot of neighborhoods in our city feel like. And so we want you to see that. So what that looks like. So that was a level of advocacy as well. And it did end up changing the bylaw. But so there's lots of different levels of advocacy that we can be involved in. And I do think that we are called to this, that this is somehow fundamental to our faith. And but it's one of those things, and I'm sure you've encountered this a lot, and probably even in this course, it's one of those things that when you start to talk about, well, when you start to talk about stuff like this, what is some of the response that you get from other Christians? When you start to talk about advocacy and caring for the poor and the widow and the orphan, what are some of the things that get said or have been said to you?
That's politics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not our faith.
Yeah, why are you talking about politics?
I've actually been told, not at Tierra Nueva, of course, but other ministries that we've done stuff with, that what kind of people are we going to have in our church if we advocate for these groups?
Wow. Wow, I guess that's probably been an undercurrent where I've been, but my goodness, like to actually say that outright.
And it was in a board meeting. My husband and I used to do Christian rap and promote it. And it was at a meeting that wanted to have a concert. Some of the people wanted a concert and some didn't. And that was the response. If we reach out to this subgenre, this group of people, then they're going to come to our church and we don't want that. And it was blatant. It blew me away, actually.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, at that point, you've just departed from the gospel. You know, like you're not even making a pretense of it, because sometimes there's the wording, and you kind of danced, you said it a little bit, Jim, but it's kind of like this isn't the gospel, you know, like, why are you talking about politics? That's not the gospel. Talk about the gospel. That's often what people say. What does this have to do with the gospel? I'm like, well, a lot, like quite a bit, actually. It seems to be fairly central too, and I'm going to go through scripturally just sort of why that is, but you know, this is pretty close to the heart of what Jesus is talking about, and what, as you said, John Pascal, what he has done for us. You know, when we think of it in those terms, this is what he has done for us. And so why would we stop short? Now, I do understand the danger of just saying the gospel is just our understanding of social justice. I understand the danger of that. But surely to say, well, what is God's understanding of justice? And to be working for that is pretty central, at least to a life of discipleship and of mission, of what we're supposed to be doing in the world. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if we can make that happen easily. That's that. Let's go to here. Okay, I want here. Can everybody see that? Yeah, okay. So the biblical foundations for accompaniment, advocacy, and liberation. In this session, we'll look for current examples of situations requiring advocacy, followed by an overview of biblical texts and perspectives on advocacy. So let me just, we'll go through some, there's a bunch of pictures here. We're not gonna go through them all in any kind of detail, but we will go through some of them just to get a picture of who it is we're talking about. So this is not from my city, but this would be a very common thing just outside my house. People, and I'm sure it is in your cities as well. People sleeping on the streets. The house next to mine is a brothel, and that's common in every major city for sure. Child soldiership. I had the opportunity to listen once to General Romeo Dallaire. He was a Canadian general who was in Rwanda during the Civil War, and has since made his life mission really about trying to rid the world of child soldiership as an idea. And just the profound level, the huge amount of work and advocacy that had to go into that work was incredible. And he just said, I'm going to give my life to this because I saw the incredible dangers of this and the ruined lives that happen as this has become an absolute feature of modern warfare, this child soldiership. Let's see, poverty and hunger, human trafficking. This is the death row thing, not a reality in Canada or in a lot of nations now, but still very much a reality in the States, and an issue absolutely for advocacy. I think this is probably a person who is a traveler, like Roma, and levels of poverty and imprisonment. These are administrative retention or detention. Something I've learned about recently is when people come to a nation, and we've been doing some advocacy around this, when they come to a nation, they're sometimes put into detention centers and held there for quite some time before, or even if they're allowed to come out. So that's their first welcome, so to speak, into a nation is in these detention centers. I know there's been a lot of talk around that on the southern border of the United States, but it's happening in Canada as well. Some of these UNHR, I'm not sure where exactly this would be. This might be in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, where I have some friends who go in and do a lot of medical work. People traveling to the Hungarian-Serbian border, and borders are starting to obviously become more and more policed and more closed. You may be familiar with the idea that in Europe, European nations have been paying certain other nations, Turkey and others, in order to do a lot of the work of keeping people there rather than coming into mainland Europe. You may be familiar with that. But that is also happening on the southern border of Mexico, where the United States has not so much paid, but is saying we'll cause some serious problems to Mexico if you're continuing to allow people from the Central American Triangle to come up through Mexico. So people can get into Mexico no problem from Guatemala and Honduras and Ecuador and some of those places, but they cannot leave the southernmost province of Mexico. And when we were down there, we got stopped by men with guns to take a look at our van to see if we were transporting anybody. So they're allowed into that area, Tapachula, but they can't go any further. So that's a reality, certainly in our world. People taking incredibly dangerous boat voyages like these. And I mean, the numbers of people who have just gone missing at sea or drowned is unbelievable. And again, maybe you're familiar with this, maybe not, but that the Italian government and other governments made laws saying that you couldn't use your own craft to go out into the ocean to try and save people whose boats had capsized. Have you heard about this? Where if there were groups that were sending boats out and trying to intercept some of these boats where people were coming from Africa and other places and Turkey, and they just knew that these boats were incredibly unsafe, and so they would bring them on board and they'd bring them back to Malta or to Italy. And so the Italian government started fining boats that were doing this, because they said, you know, once they reached shore, now they were the responsibility of the nation where they had reached. So their job, they're trying to do is prevent them from reaching the shore, even if it meant that they were dying, where they were drowning. Clearly a level of horrific injustice and the advocacy. Sweden tightens border security to stop refugees. That's happening everywhere, including in Calais. So there's huge areas of Calais which are sort of refugee settlements now, and they're trying to get over to the UK. And so that's a massive issue for the UK right now. A lot of these trucks, you'll see that there are people actually are inside the trucks and they're being smuggled across borders. What's interesting is this is a refugee settlement, sort of like a makeshift refugee settlement. It actually looks very much like the park across from my house in Vancouver was like this for about 2 years, as there was a homeless tent village. And I took a picture once in a refugee settlement and then a picture of the park across my house, and it looked identical. This is when people have no place to go. This is sort of what ends up being the reality. And I'm sure, you know, you're not unfamiliar with many of these things. So just a quick question. What are the most pressing mission challenges in your, I would say in your area, in your community or nation right now? What have you seen? What have you noticed?
Affordable housing is the huge in Asheville, and tied in obviously with homelessness, and fentanyl and meth all up in the hollers of the mountains, and yeah, the carnage that's causing.
Yeah.
And then incarceration, causes for incarceration.
Yeah. Yeah. Has fentanyl been an issue that everyone has kind of encountered, the opioid crisis?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's horrific, just horrific. 2016, that's when things seemed to shift. And I think it's kind of important for us to know some of these things too, that when, you know, advocacy requires information and knowledge and wisdom. And so knowing when things have shifted and why they've shifted, there's some good movies out there, some good documentaries that talk about this, about why things changed in 2016. And we started noticing it when we were working with people in recovery. They had a cycle that people knew they could go out and use, and they could come back and they could sort of figure things out, but people started going out and then they would not come back. And it's because the heroin that was in our neighborhood was being replaced with fentanyl. And now I'm reliably informed that there is no heroin in my neighborhood. My neighborhood is one of the highest uses of intravenous drug use in the Western world, but they said there's no heroin, it's all fentanyl now. And so I've had dear friends who died of this because they don't know, because it's just so potent, it's so strong, and it's in everything. And it is just absolutely wiping people out. I mean, we had months here over the last couple of years where we would have 3 or 4 deaths due to COVID and 185 overdose deaths. And still all the news was about these COVID deaths, and it's real, like that's a real thing, but it's like, who's talking about this other thing? And it's because nobody's talking about it, because it doesn't, people think, well, that doesn't actually affect me. I'm not in danger of dying of an opioid overdose. I am in danger of dying of COVID. So that's, you know, we tend to just care about the things that are going to affect us. That's a huge issue.
There's also
What other-
videos of the fentanyl affecting police officers that make stops, and they just by inhaling they overdose.
Yeah, it's incredibly potent. It's incredibly potent. And I mean, I've talked to all my kids, everybody, like, it's even in some of the weed here. You know, there was a grade 9 kid in my kid's school who overdosed and died in the last month. Like, it's everywhere, and it is an absolute huge problem. Huge problem. Yeah. Any other pressing mission challenges in your community or nation?
I was going to say refugees, having refugees coming. And then, of course, in Canada, I'm thinking about the people coming from Ukraine who aren't being, well, I mean, I live in New Westminster. My husband works with Journey Home Community. And so thinking about how the Ukrainian people aren't refugees, even though they are, but they're being given a visa. So I kind of wonder how they're going to be accessing help when they come to Canada, since they don't fall under refugee programs. But also just hearing on the refugee side that like even Journey Home, they just can't take everybody. There's just so many.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, there's lots of reasons why I was so distressed about the Russian-Ukrainian scenario, but part of it, I do work with refugees as well. And I just knew that all the people who we were working to try and bring to Canada were not going to get, that was definitely going on the back burner now as well, because
Yeah.
now everything is focused here, and it just, I don't know if, have people encountered this before? I'm sure you have, but where people who aren't necessarily inclined to help, say, refugees anyways, but they would go, well, why are we giving so much help to refugees when our own vets are homeless?
Yeah.
You know? And I mean, the thing I want to say is, well, then go and help. Like, why are you going and helping the vet? Like, I don't know that you really care about your vets. I'm not convinced about that. But I'm pretty sure that, you know, when they're divvying up the pie in terms of help that's available, it's not between those two. Like we could help more. We could help everybody. We wouldn't have to pit people against each other. But that's that really bothers me when people do that. So yeah, that is definitely happening as well. I mean, we already were at record numbers of displaced people around the world. I think there's something in the neighborhood of 84 million people around the world who are being displaced. And now there's a further 12 million Ukrainians, 6 million who have been displaced out of Ukraine, and 6 million who are internally displaced within the Ukraine. So now it's just, the numbers are record numbers of people on the move around the world, and in danger. Yeah. So there's quite a lot to be, you know, and do you ever feel overwhelmed by this stuff? Yeah. It's just like, it's everything, right? It does get overwhelming. Absolutely. 20 million illegal immigrants in the USA. This is 2004. There'd be more. I tend not to use that word ever, illegal, because people are allowed to, certainly there's no illegal refugee. You know, you're allowed to go and make that claim. That's not illegal. So I tend to not, I just try and avoid that word, because it tends to be a word that's weaponized. You know, as soon as you hear that, you go, well, then why are they here? You know, and that's what, you know, when we started hearing about the caravans. You remember the caravan that was coming up? Everyone was all nervous about coming up into the States from, again, the Central America. There's a caravan, and there's been a caravan coming up of migrants for 20 years. You know, that happens every year, but it was an election cycle. So it was the kind of thing that people could then use. They could weaponize this notion. And so you started hearing certain politicians talking about everybody coming up from these places are thugs and rapists and gang members and all this kind of stuff. And even just calling it a caravan or a horde of refugees is the kind of wording that you use in order to dehumanize people. And we just started noticing, when I was talking with my friends, particularly in the States, about stuff, that their hackles would raise so quickly. And I've started to learn that when that happens, I'm like, oh, there's something spiritual going on here. There's an idol that's being pushed. You know, that something is, and I'm like that, because I knew these people, and I knew that they actually were kind and loving people, but suddenly they got all, their shoulders would raise and they would get really angry and it became impossible to talk to them. I thought there's a spiritual stronghold happening here. And so I wanted to get down, and so we did. We went down, but not to the southern border of the US. We went down to the southern border of Mexico. And so this is a train that's called La Bestia, the Beast. And it stops in this little village called Arriaga. And so we got to go down to this village. And by the time we got down there, so there would be thousands of people on this train that would slowly, very slowly, wind its way through Central America up into Mexico and up towards the northern border of Mexico. By the time we got there, there was nobody. The train was still going, but there was nobody on the train because of the US policies that had stopped this. And so anybody who was on that train would be pulled off and arrested, and we put into vans and sent back down to Guatemala or Honduras or Ecuador. And the people in the town, was really interesting, is they had begun as really kind, and they would come and they'd bring bread to the people who were on the trains, and they would feed them and they bring water because being the heat of the day, it's unbelievable. But they started to really hear this message again and again and again from, well, these people are actually they're terrorists and they're thugs and they're rapists and they're dangerous. So by the time we got there, that was the idea of what a migrant was that they were dangerous people. And so we took, and these were from Christians, and so we took some of these Christians into the refugee settlements to meet with people, some of whom had come from the Congo and Mauritania, places in Africa, and they'd managed to get across to Brazil and had made their way, often by walking, all the way up to Mexico. And we got to meet and talk with them, kids, you know, and the mindset of the people completely changed when they met humans in this scenario. And that too is advocacy. You know, we weren't necessarily speaking truth to power in that moment, aside from the power of that mindset that had infiltrated the minds of these Christians who had believed the messaging that these people were all just criminals. And then they got to meet families and go, wait a minute, that something, this person is just kind of like where I'm at. You know, this person is no different than me. So that was a level of advocacy that we got to participate in for sure. We'll skip past this, gentleman. Here's for our Swiss friend, I think. What does that say? You know? Are you familiar with that, Jean-Pascal? You're on mute. I think you're still on mute.
Yes, it's to take care of the security. Sicherheit schaffen.
Sicherheit schaffen. So I had a strange experience. I suppose it's not that strange, but to witness it firsthand. My wife and I were taking a bus from Italy to Switzerland through overnight, and we got to I think it was I can't remember which mountain it was, but there was a stop there right at the border, and the Swiss guards came on, and they went through the bus, and they saw us, and they didn't even ask for our passports. But every single person on that bus who was not fair-skinned, every single person on that bus who was of color was taken off of that bus. And a few came back on, but most of them didn't. And it was very interesting to watch. It says we didn't feel in any kind of, they knew, oh, you're Canadian, you're fine, you're gonna go through. But I can't imagine that fear. Going, well, I'm just trying to get through to here, but I can't. So that's very much a reality, certainly in Europe as well. So Stephen Matson said, although there might be many political, financial, and logistical reasons for citizens to reject the influx of global refugees, there are no theological ones. I like that line. Mm-hmm. Maybe many political, financial, and logistical reasons, but there are no theological ones. It may be inconvenient, uncomfortable, and extremely hard, but Jesus wants us to care for these people, the poor, homeless, sick, persecuted, downtrodden, and oppressed. So here are some biblical perspectives on immigrants and refugees. So this is just one issue that we'll take a look at. Jeremiah 22:3, thus says the Lord, do justice and righteousness and deliver the one who has been robbed from the power of his oppressor. Also, do not mistreat or do violence to the stranger, the orphan, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place. You know, there is, and I understand why there is this idea out there that Christians are not for refugees. And the church has given lots of, the vocal church has given lots of reasons for people to make that come to that conclusion. But everywhere I've gone, the church is welcoming people in. It's just doing it quietly and faithfully. And everywhere it is doing that, it is thriving. It is doing well. It has in many places understood this message, that this is somehow central to what we do. And again, where the church is doing that, it is thriving, and it is because it's living out its purpose. One of its purposes is to do this good in the world. Hebrews 13, 1-2, let love of the brethren continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it. James 2:5, listen, my beloved brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? You may have already talked about this in your class, but Jesus and the baptism at the border, have you already talked about that? I know Bob's teaching on that, where he talks about Jesus as the coyote, the one who smuggles people from one border to the next, one land to the next. I love that teaching. I think it's beautiful. That the Jordan River is the Rio Grande. I think it's a fascinating notion. I think it's very, very true that this is what Jesus has done for us. And so there are many Jesuses who are still doing that today. Helping people from one to the next, the people smuggler or the coyote. In fact, when we were down in the southern border of Mexico, there was a guy who was our guide, and he took us down into Guatemala, and he took us back across, and he had been a coyote. And it was interesting because when he got introduced to us by an American missionary, we were told that he had been a human trafficker. And so we went, whoa, okay, that's interesting. He's like, yeah, but he's saved now and he's all good. And so we just got to hear his story, and it turns out he wasn't a human trafficker. He was a coyote. He would smuggle people, but he wasn't trafficking them. It's a very different thing. Trafficking and smuggling is a very, very different thing. People smuggling implies the procurement for financial or material gain of the illegal entry into a state of which that person is neither a citizen nor a permanent resident. There is a distinction between people smuggling and human trafficking, and it is that one is voluntary and one is forced. And a coyote, someone who's smuggling someone, is not forcing anybody. They are providing a service of helping one person get from one place to another. The relationship between smuggler and migrant ends once the individual arrives in the new country. But there are some people who would continue to exploit illegal migrants, and that would be more of a trafficking scenario. So it's important for us to understand some of these terms and to be able to say, because he was holding incredible shame that he had done this thing, and shame that had been really reinforced by this ministry that he was part of. I just was talking to him. I was like, did you care for people? He's like, oh yeah, I made sure that they got to where they need to go. I took care of them. I made sure they were safe. I'm like, well, I don't know. That doesn't sound like human trafficking to me. That sounds a little bit different. Anyway, so the Father as a people smuggler or coyote, Colossians 1:12-14, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light, for he rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. So he has moved us from one place to another. I'm careful with this in some sense, because I don't wish to imply that, for instance, Guatemala is the domain of darkness and the United States of America is the kingdom of his beloved Son. I don't wish to imply that. And sometimes we can get into, that feeds into this notion of, well, they're all just trying to get here because, their life is crap and their country is terrible and they just want to get here. Most people actually don't really want to leave their home. They would prefer to be able to be in their home where they grew up, where they love. I know lots of people in that scenario. And actually, when they get to America or Canada, they have a real hard time. It's not really the greatest scenario for them. And some of the reasons why there's so much difficulty in places like, say, Colombia and other places is because of different policies and different greed and lusts from places like North America. So I think it's a more of a subtle and nuanced question than just people want to get here. I don't know if you've heard that stuff before, but people just want to get here and steal our way of life. Well, no, they want to do right by their families, and it's really extraordinarily dangerous right now in some places. Any questions or concerns at this point?
the shooting in Buffalo, the replacement kind, that kind of garbage or poison that they're coming to replace
Yeah.
white
Yes.
culture and all.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, let's hang out in there for a second. I mean, there is that the you know, people have heard a lot about CRT. There's this GRT, the Great Replacement Theory. I don't know if people have heard about this, but this fear of this globalist agenda of essentially, you know, white people being replaced. And so the notion is that certain people like the idea of migration and refugees and so on, because it does a quicker job of replacing white people and so on. And it's just, I mean, it's just not true. Like it's not verifiable. And the fact is that migration is an absolute fact of human existence. We have always migrated. We, you know, if there's any white people in North America, it's because they migrated. You know, like you want to talk about replacement, you know, like that's how that happened. We migrate, we do that. That's not an evil thing. And it's in some ways it's our notion of sovereign states and a sovereign nation, and those are idols that cause us to get so concerned about that. Really, you know, what are we trying to defend? So yeah, I think you're right, Jim. That's where that is the stuff that is leading to horrific violence, really horrific violence. And we have to not just be on our guard against it, but to be really opposed to that would be my take. And that's part of advocacy as well. Okay, we'll skip through. Strangers and aliens. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul. So, and this is just sort of what Jean-Pascal, you were talking about, how we are aliens and strangers in this world. Paroikos, which is to live as a foreigner, a person who for a period of time lives in a place which is not his normal residence, alien, stranger, temporary resident. And this is the term that's used of us on earth. You know, it's a term that we might use of others, illegal aliens. But you know, that's the term that's used of us in scripture on earth. This is not our final home. So this is our Christian identity, strangers and aliens. All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. That's from Hebrews 11:13. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who reside as aliens, scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who are chosen. This is how Peter defines and describes the Christians: reside as aliens. But then we are called, you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of God's household. So we have been moved from strangers and aliens into the household. And this is, I think one of the goals that we can do is that, you know, God sets the lonely in families. That's the thing that people have asked us, why do we move to the downtown east side? And my wife and I were living in Ontario, and we had 2 children. And when we found out that we had a third on the way, we had a lot of options, but we said, okay, we're going to move to the downtown east side of Vancouver because God sets the lonely in families. And we need family. And also, if God's going to set the lonely in families, then there needs to be family there. And I think this seems to be a theme running through, certainly, well, all scripture, that God is taking those who have no home and making home with them. And so that's one of the privileges, one of the beauties that we get to do. We're no longer called strangers and aliens because we have been made fellow citizens with the saints and members of God's household. So that's something that we can extend to others as well. Come and be part of the household. And that's not just spiritualized. That is something that actually is meant to be enacted, I think, in this world. Seeing the people, this is from Matthew 9, seeing the people, he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, beg the Lord of the harvest to cast out workers into his harvest. That's us. I don't think we have time right now to take 15 minutes. We only have about another 20 minutes here. Just want to see where I'm going. Right. Already done that. Something about the action of advocacy that I think doesn't get talked about enough is that when you advocate for someone, you at least run the risk of sharing their condition and treatment. Maybe the easiest way to explain this, maybe some people had this experience, I don't know, but if someone is getting bullied, maybe in high school you knew somebody was getting bullied, or maybe you were getting bullied, and you wonder, why aren't other people joining? Why aren't people coming in to defend the person being bullied? Right? But because the fear is, if you join in that person who's getting bullied, what's going to happen to you? The same thing. You're going to get bullied. But there's this incredible power that happens when somebody goes, I am willing to risk that. I am willing to risk being bullied, and I'm going to come in and stand with you. And that's sort of what advocacy does mean. And now, when we're coming from places of power and privilege, often we don't face the exact same scenarios, but you can face some serious repercussions. As we're advocating, say, for people who are on death row, chances are we're not going to be put on death row, but you are going to start getting painted with that brush if you're engaged in that for too long. Has that happened to anybody where you've joined somebody in that place and you have then started to receive the same kind of treatment? Well, this is partly what the word. Go ahead, Jean-Pascal.
I was writing. Can you repeat your just a question, please?
Have you been in a scenario where you were advocating for somebody and you faced the same kind of treatment or a similar kind of treatment that they were receiving?
Sometimes, but not the same. But I remember when we arrived in the town we choose to live in a neighborhood for Swiss people, but a poor neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not normal for Swiss people to live there. And when we met, I don't know, like it was like old friends of my wife when she was young, and she just talked to them, told them that we are living now there. They just look like shocked, or what problem do you have? Or
right, yeah.
What kind of problem is hidden? Caché, hidden in your life, or so on. So okay, but yes.
And I mean that's true. That's relatively minor, but it's still, that's a reality. The word compassion, you may be familiar with, literally means to suffer alongside. That's the word. Like passion is suffer and calm is to, alongside. To suffer alongside is what it means. And the Hebrew word is rahem, which is like a womb. So when God has compassion on his children, it's like he feels them in his womb, like that we are to share with. And it's actually, to have compassion is an invitation to share in Jesus's life. And when he invites people in, he's inviting them into poverty of spirit and into mourning and into meekness and into peacemaking, which leads us into persecution for the sake of righteousness, for Jesus's sake. Like this is the discipleship call. And there's a lot of false persecution narratives out there of they just don't like us because we're Christian. I think sometimes that means they just don't like you because you're being a jerk. But to actually follow Jesus into these places of compassion, to suffer alongside, does mean you start to share the treatment that those you are standing alongside also receive. the Father Dan Berrigan quote, when they come for the poor, a curse on you and your religion if they do not have to step over your broken and bleeding body. That, I mean, and that's when I think about Oscar Romero, Archbishop Oscar Romero of San Salvador. Maybe some of you will be familiar with him, but he became the Archbishop at a time when there was great social turmoil, and what they call the School for the Americas, which is a CIA-run operation to train repressive governments and militaries throughout Central America on how to torture and disappear its own citizens, was doing that in El Salvador, and the church was complicit, or at least quiet. And Archbishop Oscar Romero was elevated to that position because they thought he wouldn't be a problem, because he was an intellectual book nerd like myself, and he just loved that stuff, wasn't all that interested. But it's when he was kidnapped and taken to one of the garbage heaps and shown some of his parishioners whose bodies had been tortured, that his mind was changed, his heart was changed, and he started to realize, I need to speak out about this. And so he began to advocate from his position of incredible power as the Archbishop, but towards power, towards the government, towards the military. They didn't like it. They were telling him to be quiet, but he would not do that. And eventually, after he gave a homily for a group of nuns, he was assassinated, because he would have to share in the exact same treatment that those who he was advocating for were sharing. When you think about it, this is what Jesus has done for us, isn't it? And his advocacy for us is not from afar. He has taken on exactly our condition. He has taken on our flesh and blood. He has taken on rejection. He has taken on even the feeling of forsakenness. My God, why have you forsaken me? He has taken even that on, the full of that human condition, to experience it utterly. When evil has come for us, they had to step over the broken and bleeding body of Jesus. This is the life, the blessed life, that we are welcomed into. How can we respond? This first one is tricky. Inform yourself through reliable news sources. I don't know who's found some really reliable news sources. It's tough. It's tough. I mean, because there's bias everywhere, and we know this. And we tend to think reliable is that which agrees with my viewpoint. So we have to be really, really careful there, but we do need to seek out, where do we find reliable news sources? We do need to intercede as led by the Spirit. Ask the Spirit, what is it that you want us to be praying for and how? Overcoming evil with good, which is actually remembering that even those who would call ourselves our enemies, we're to overcome evil with good. Practicing enemy love. Engaging in Jesus's ministries is practicing the gospel, welcoming immigrants and refugees, remembering where our true citizenship lies. I know there's been a lot already, and there is more to come. There's quite a bit more here, but are there any questions or concerns at this point, or comments or helpful rebukes?
A question there, and the Canadian general who spent his life after Rwanda, his name again is?
Romeo Dallaire, and it's a D''Allaire. The movie Hotel Rwanda was partly his story, although he says it's mostly not true, that movie. But he's written he wrote a book called They Fight Like Soldiers, They Die Like Children, which is kind of a life-changing book.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say about, this is what I hear, that in years to come, we're going to become a third world poor country because we can't take care of everyone. And I'm thinking, okay, how am I supposed to look at that? I feel like God will take care of us because we're doing the right thing. Or could you say some things about that?
Sure. That fear. So I guess first of all, there's already places in North America, in America and in Canada that would be very much in that condition already. So already we're not caring for people. So a number of inner cities, reservations in Canada, places where that's already true. So then when we start to pull that back a little bit, what we mean is, well, my sense of comfort is going to be threatened. And I think as that quote that I quoted earlier said, there may well be economic and political reasons why you might say no to some of this stuff, but there aren't good theological ones. And so I think it comes down to, what do we make a priority? What carries the most weight for us? Is it our sense of well-being? Is it our economic, political security? Or is it doing the will of God? And I mean, so I live in a very, very, very poor neighborhood, and we have not made a lot of money. And so sometimes people ask me, like, well, is that unsafe for your kids? Is that, why don't you live somewhere else where it could be safer? I'm like, well, but what about the good things in life? And I go, well, we just have to reevaluate that, and we have to reorient our gaze on that which is the good stuff of life, which is not this economic and political dream which has been fostered in a lot of in the West of endless prosperity. That's just, it's not really a reality, and we only have that at the expense of others. And so I would just call us to say, our first and foremost priority has to be doing the will of God, being faithful to what God calls us to, trusting God in that. That doesn't mean that we're going to have the same level of income, or that doesn't mean that we're going to have the same quality of life, even in terms of what the world sees as the good life. We might, but probably not. But that's not the most important thing. And so I would, anybody who kind of would say that, I would urge to probably read the first at least 2 chapters of Revelation and see the churches in different places, and where Jesus says, you think you're poor, but actually you're rich. To one of the churches when they were desperately poor, and to others, he says, you think you're rich, but you're actually quite poor. Where is the blessing lying? It's lying in the invitation into the very life of Jesus, who had said he had no home to lay his head, and who died a martyr death. So I think part of that question involves us having to rearrange where our priorities lie. And then that will reveal a little bit of what we're worshiping, what we're devoted to.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Seek first the kingdom of God, and everything else will be added on.
Yeah, which doesn't mean necessarily a yacht. I've been on a yacht, but I didn't own it. But what is the everything else? It's the everything else that we could possibly need. And so when we seek first the kingdom of God, we start to see that which really, really matters. And we start to devote our lives to that thing. And then the other things don't matter as much. You know, I love when Paul is sent out after the Council of Acts in Acts 15, and he's writing about it later, and he says, the one thing they told me to do is do not forget the poor. Like, remember the poor. And he said, it was the very thing that I longed to do. And it's still like, that's when he went around, he was a big part of his letters are actually raising money for the poor from places that were also kind of poor, but they were just learning to share together. And it sounds awfully socialist, and it wasn't socialist, it was Christian. The socialists stole it from Christians, but and others, but it was saying, like, we're going to live this differently, that we understand that trying to live this protected life on our own means, in our own way, is going to lead to harm, and it has led to harm. There's another Jacques Ellul book, which I'd recommend to you, called The Meaning of the City. And he goes through scripturally all the mentions of cities. And he says they're not good. They represent something. That the first city builder is Cain. That he is told by God, he's afraid that he's going to be killed because he's a fratricide. He's killed his brother, and God says, no, I'll give you a mark. The mark is to protect him. But he doesn't believe it. He doesn't trust in God's provision. So he builds a city. And again and again and again, humans build cities because we don't trust in God's provision. We trust in our own ingenuity. But when we do that, we build walls and we build swords, and we build armies, and we build economies that are trying to protect us. But we end up making walls to keep people on the other side because we start to get concerned about them, that they're going to come and steal our stuff. And so then they have to become the enemy. And so when we can change that notion around and see people as kin and neighbor rather than enemy. And look, I live in a neighborhood where people do come in and steal stuff pretty regular, you know, that does happen. And we have to figure out ways to say, hey, come in our front door, don't come in our back door, don't jump the fence, come and knock on the front door, and you can have what, you know, we'll share everything we've got with you. It's not easy, but it is good. And I think if I'll say this pretty strongly, I think if Christians are not trying to live out that level of discipleship, then we have no business even trying to do advocacy. And we probably have no business calling ourselves really followers of Jesus. Because I think, you know, and I'll put it this way too. I remember being asked at a denominational meeting once, big denominational meeting, to come and pray for justice. And I was really concerned about this. I said, I don't know that you want me to pray for justice, because if, you know, the story of the Exodus is a story of advocacy, where the cries of Israel go up and God hears, and then, you know, Moses is used as an advocate for the people of Israel, for the enslaved people of Israel, to liberate them. I said, if there had been somebody in Egypt at that time, maybe an employee of the Pharaoh, and they said, we're going to pray to Yahweh for justice. You know, we're going to spend a lot of time praying to Yahweh for justice. That would be a really bad idea, right? Like from the Egyptian perspective, that'd be a really bad idea. To say, God, we want your justice to happen in our land. Yeah, we own slaves and we, you know, all that, but we want your justice to happen. Rather, they should probably be praying for mercy. You know, pray for mercy first. And so when we're in this position where the security that we hold is held at the you know, the end of a gun, or the end of a nuclear missile, or the end of whatever it is, you know, the huge economic disparities, even within our own nations and our own communities, I would say to hold on to that level of economic prosperity, and then to also ask God for justice, is a really dangerous thing to do. More, we should be praying for liberation from our own attachments and mercy, would be my suspicion there. So, I mean, I've kind of jumped, we're not gonna have time to finish the other 24 slides here. And I've just said some big things. So we have a few minutes left if anybody has any questions about that. That was a really good question, Carol, thank you.
Thank you.
I think Isaiah 61 sums up pretty much what we're called to do.
Isaiah 61. Yeah. 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 And it was Jesus's mission statement, right? Although he stopped before declaring the year of the Lord's wrath, but yeah, this is the thing. Also, Isaiah 58. Isaiah 58 is a very, very powerful and challenging passage about what it means to worship God. If you pour yourself out on behalf of, like that's what it means to worship God. Then you'll be called restorer of streets to dwell in. Then you can actually be an advocate. Like it requires this level of total devotion.
Aaron, you mentioned the shift in 2016. You said there are some documentaries. Any specific titles about that?
Yeah,
big
what's the
change in
one?
fentanyl and all?
There's one. Oh, let me see if I can find it. Show about fentanyl. I can find it for you here. There's a series called Poisoned, and then there's one called Dope. Dope is a documentary that examines fentanyl's impact on addicts. Poisoned is what's interesting. It shows how the fentanyl crisis was actually, it wasn't created in Colombia, you know, it was created by pharmacology and the over application of fentanyl and these painkillers into the general population. That's how people get it. It's people sell stuff that has been actually prescribed to people, and it's also, I mean, it's so interconnected with our even the question that Carol asked, like our own sense of well-being, that we shouldn't feel pain. This is too big a topic for us to get into right now, but I feel this very deeply, that this sense of we shouldn't feel pain, and it's wrong for us to feel pain. We've done something maybe even morally wrong if we're feeling pain, and so we should have these painkillers, and so we rely on not a life well lived, but for the medical system to take care of our pain for us, and then we end up in this scenario where we're addicted to opioids, and now we're not living well. Like, it's a really huge problem, and as always, it tends to hit the poorest of the poor most severely. Right. So those are Dope and Poisoned are two good ones to watch. There was recently a documentary made about called Love in the Time of Fentanyl, about my neighborhood, and some friends of mine who have been working in what's called these harm reduction sites, which are places where you can go in and you can use fentanyl, and nurses will watch you do it, and in order to try and preserve your life. And I have ambiguous feelings around that, but they are literally saving people's lives. So it's very fascinating. I'll leave you with one more Elul quote here, and it's a bit of a worrisome one. But he wrote this. He said, "One thing, however, is sure: unless Christians fulfill their prophetic role, unless they become the advocates and defenders of the truly poor, witness to their misery, then infallibly violence will suddenly break out. In one way or other, their blood cries to heaven, and violence will seem the only way out. It will be too late to try to calm them and create harmony." And we have seen that throughout human history, where the church, when it has not done its job, when it has not advocated, when it has not cared for, when it has cared more for its own prosperity and protection and security, and even its mission and ministry than it does for the poor in its midst, violence breaks out. And that has happened in the last couple of years. It will happen again. So it is utterly imperative for Christians to fulfill their prophetic role in this.